You think you know what justice looks like? You think you understand the price of disrespect? What I'm about to tell you happened in the scorching deserts of Arizona Territory in 1887, and it changed everything anyone thought they knew about power, honor, and revenge. This isn't just another Western tale. This is the story of how one man's cruelty awakened a force that would shake the very foundations of the frontier. Picture this: Tombstone, Arizona. The sun beats down mercilessly on the dusty streets where cowboys, miners, and drifters walk alongside the occasional Apache who dares to venture into white man's territory. The air is thick with tension, prejudice, and the constant threat of violence. In this powder keg of a town, Sheriff Marcus Dalton rules with an iron fist and a heart full of hatred. Dalton wasn't just any lawman. He was a man who believed that his badge gave him the right to treat anyone he deemed inferior, however he pleased. Standing 6 feet tall with cold grey eyes and a perpetual sneer, he had built his reputation on intimidation and brutality. The townspeople feared him almost as much as they respected his ability to keep order, or what he called order. On this particular scorching Tuesday morning, the temperature had already climbed past 90 degrees before most folks had finished their breakfast. The streets of Tombstone were beginning to stir with the usual activity: merchants opening their stores, horses being hitched to posts, and the distant sound of pickaxes from the silver mines echoing through the valley. That's when she appeared. Ayanna walked into town with the grace and dignity that seemed to flow through her very being. Her long black hair was braided with small turquoise beads that caught the morning light, and her traditional Apache dress was both modest and beautiful. She carried herself with a quiet strength that spoke of deep roots and unshakable confidence. But to the untrained eye of the white settlers, she was just another Apache woman, someone to be watched with suspicion and treated with disdain. What none of them knew, what Sheriff Dalton couldn't have imagined in his worst nightmares, was that Ayanna was the daughter of Cochise's most trusted war chief, Nalnish. Her father commanded the respect of over 300 Apache warriors across multiple bands, men who would ride through fire and storm for their leader's honor, but in Tombstone she was just another target for Dalton's prejudice. Ayanna had come to town for a simple purpose: to trade some of her mother's hand-woven baskets for supplies her family needed. She had made this journey before, always keeping to herself, conducting her business quietly, and leaving without incident. She understood the delicate balance required to survive in a world where her people were seen as enemies, where one wrong move could mean death. She approached Martinez's general store, one of the few establishments where she had been treated with basic human decency in the past. The elderly Mexican shopkeeper, Carlos Martinez, had always been fair in his dealings, never trying to cheat her or treat her with the open hostility she faced elsewhere. As Ayanna examined some fabric near the store's entrance, Sheriff Dalton emerged from the saloon across the street. He had been drinking since dawn, not unusual for him, and the whiskey had amplified his already volatile temperament. His deputies, Jake Morrison and Tom Bradley, flanked him as they swaggered across the dusty street. Dalton's eyes fixed on Ayanna immediately. In his twisted mind, he saw an opportunity to assert his dominance, to remind everyone in town exactly who held the power. He had humiliated Apache people before, and in his experience, they rarely fought back when outnumbered in white territory. "Well, well, well," Dalton called out, his voice carrying across the street and causing several townspeople to stop and stare. "Look what we have here, boys. Another savage thinking she can just waltz into our town like she owns the place." Ayanna looked up from the fabric, her dark eyes meeting Dalton's gaze steadily. She had encountered men like him before, men who used their position to compensate for their own insecurities and failures. She said nothing, hoping that silence would allow her to complete her business and leave without incident. But Dalton wasn't interested in letting her go quietly. He strode across the street with his deputies in tow, his hand resting casually on the grip of his Colt 45. The townspeople began to gather, some out of curiosity, others out of a morbid fascination with watching someone else's misery. A few, like Carlos Martinez, watched with growing concern, knowing that nothing good could come from this confrontation. "I'm talking to you, squaw," Dalton snarled, using the derogatory term with deliberate malice. "Don't you know it's polite to answer when a white man speaks to you?" Ayanna straightened, her chin lifting slightly. When she spoke, her voice was calm and measured, with only the slightest accent coloring her perfect English. "I am here to trade, Sheriff. I mean no trouble." Dalton laughed, a harsh sound that grated against the morning air. "Trade? You think you have something worth trading? You people don't own anything worth having." The crowd was growing larger now. Some of the onlookers shifted uncomfortably, sensing that this was escalating beyond the usual harassment. Others, unfortunately, seemed to be enjoying the spectacle. "Sheriff," Carlos Martinez called out from his store's doorway, "the lady has always conducted herself properly here. Perhaps you should mind your own business, Martinez," Dalton snapped, not taking his eyes off Ayanna, "unless you want to find yourself on the wrong side of the law, too." The threat was clear, and Martinez reluctantly stepped back, though his weathered face showed his disapproval. Dalton moved closer to Ayanna, invading her personal space in a way that was clearly intended to intimidate. "You know what I think? I think you Apache need to be reminded of your place. You think because the government put you on reservations instead of wiping you out completely, that makes you equal to decent white folks." Ayanna's hands remained steady, but those who knew how to read the signs could see the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her breathing had become more controlled. She was preparing herself, though for what no one could say. "I have done nothing wrong," she said quietly. "I wish only to complete my business and return to my family." "Your family?" Dalton's voice dripped with contempt. "You mean that collection of drunks and thieves living in the desert? Tell me, squaw, what would your family do if something happened to you here? Would they even care? Or would they just be relieved to have one less mouth to feed?" The insult hit its mark, and for the first time Ayanna's composure flickered. Her father's teachings echoed in her mind. "Strength is not always in the strike, my daughter. Sometimes strength is in knowing when to strike and when to endure." "Aye." But Dalton wasn't finished. He had tasted blood in the water, and like a shark, he was driven to attack. "Matter of fact," he continued, his voice getting louder so the entire crowd could hear, "I think you need to learn some respect. Boys, I think this Apache woman needs to understand how things work in a civilized town." Deputies Morrison and Bradley exchanged glances. They had followed Dalton's orders before, even when those orders crossed lines that decent men shouldn't cross. But something about this felt different. Maybe it was the way the woman carried herself, or maybe it was the growing unease of the crowd, but both men hesitated. "Sheriff," Morrison said carefully, "maybe we should just send her on her way. She hasn't caused any real trouble." Dalton's head snapped toward his deputy, his eyes blazing with fury. "Are you questioning my judgment, Morrison? Are you telling me how to do my job?" Morrison quickly shook his head. "No, sir. Just thinking maybe—" "Don't think," Dalton cut him off. "Just follow orders." He turned back to Ayanna, who had remained perfectly still throughout this exchange. Her dark eyes never left his face, and something in her gaze made him even angrier. She wasn't showing the fear he expected, the submission he demanded. "You know what I think your problem is," Dalton said, stepping even closer. "I think you've forgotten that you're nothing but a conquered people. I think you need a reminder of what happens to savages who don't show proper respect." Without warning, he reached out and grabbed the turquoise beads from her hair, yanking them free with such force that several strands of her long black hair came with them. The beads scattered across the dusty street, some breaking as they hit the hard-packed earth. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Even in a town accustomed to rough justice and frontier brutality, this felt wrong. The beads weren't just jewelry. Everyone could see they held cultural significance, and destroying them was an act of deliberate desecration. Ayana's hand moved instinctively to her hair where the beads had been torn away. For a moment, her carefully maintained composure cracked, and pain flashed across her features. Not physical pain, but something deeper. Those beads had been a gift from her grandmother, blessed in traditional ceremonies and worn with pride. "There," Dalton said with satisfaction, "now you look more like what you are, a dirty savage who doesn't belong in civilized society." But he wasn't done. The whiskey, the crowd, and his own twisted nature drove him to push further. "In fact," he continued, his voice taking on a dangerous edge, "I think you need a more thorough lesson in respect. Boys, escort this woman to the jail. I think she needs some time to think about her attitude." "On what charges?" Martinez called out, unable to stay silent any longer despite the risk. "Disturbing the peace," Dalton replied without hesitation. "Threatening behavior. Take your pick." Morrison and Bradley moved reluctantly toward Ayana, but she stepped back, her eyes now blazing with controlled fury. "I have broken no laws," she said, her voice still steady, but carrying an undertone that made several people in the crowd shift nervously. "You have no right to detain me." Dalton laughed again. "Rights? You think you have rights? The only right you have is the right to do what I tell you to do." He nodded to his deputies, who moved to grab Ayana's arms. But as Morrison reached for her, she stepped aside with fluid grace, avoiding his grasp. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," Bradley warned, though his heart clearly wasn't in it. "I will not be caged like an animal for crimes I have not committed," Ayana replied, her voice carrying a strength that seemed to resonate in the very air around them. Dalton's face flushed red, with anger and embarrassment. Being defied by an Apache woman in front of half the town was more than his ego could bear. "Grab her!" he shouted, "and if she resists, we'll add assaulting an officer to the charges." What happened next would be talked about in Tombstone for years to come. As the two deputies moved toward her again, Ayana did something unexpected. Instead of running or fighting, she stood perfectly still and began to speak in Apache, her voice carrying clearly across the silent street. Most of the townspeople couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't a plea or a prayer, it was a declaration. Those few who knew some Apache words caught fragments: dishonor, justice, and retribution. "Shut her up!" Dalton screamed, but Ayana continued speaking, her voice growing stronger with each word. Morrison finally managed to grab her arm, but as he did, she turned to look directly at Sheriff Dalton. When she spoke again, it was in perfect English, and her words cut through the desert air like a blade. "You have dishonored the daughter of Naalnish, war chief of the Chiricahua Apache. You have broken sacred things and shown contempt for what is holy. This will not be forgotten. This will not go unanswered." For a moment the name didn't register with Dalton, but several people in the crowd began to murmur, and Carlos Martinez went pale. "Naalnish," someone whispered. "Did she say Naalnish?" The name began to ripple through the crowd like wildfire. Even on the frontier, even among white settlers, the name of Naalnish was known. He was one of the most respected and feared Apache war chiefs, a man who commanded hundreds of warriors and whose word was law among his people. But Dalton, in his arrogance and ignorance, either didn't know the significance of the name or didn't care. "I don't care if your father is Geronimo himself," he snarled. "You're going to jail, and you're going to learn some respect." He grabbed Ayana's other arm roughly, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to leave bruises. "And maybe while you're in my jail, you'll learn some other lessons too." The implication in his voice made several women in the crowd turn away in disgust. Even on the frontier, where life was hard and justice was often rough, there were lines that decent men didn't cross. As Dalton and his deputies dragged Ayanna toward the jail, she didn't struggle or cry out. But her eyes never left Dalton's face, and in those dark depths, he should have seen his doom approaching. Instead, he saw only what he wanted to see: another conquered enemy, another victory for white supremacy. The jail was a small, sturdy building made of adobe and stone, with thick iron bars on the windows and a heavy wooden door reinforced with metal strips. It had been built to hold drunks, thieves, and the occasional murderer awaiting trial or execution. Dalton threw Ayanna into the single cell with unnecessary force, causing her to stumble and catch herself against the rough stone wall. "There," he said with satisfaction. "Now you can think about your attitude, and maybe later, when I've had a few more drinks, I'll come back and we can discuss your situation more privately." The threat was unmistakable, and Ayanna's jaw tightened. But she said nothing, merely moved to the small window and looked out at the desert beyond the town. Dalton locked the cell and hung the key on a hook near his desk. "Morrison, Bradley, you boys keep an eye on things here. I'm going back to the saloon. Don't let anyone visit our guest without my permission." As the sheriff left, Morrison and Bradley exchanged worried glances. "Jake," Bradley said quietly, "I got a bad feeling about this. That name she mentioned, Nalnish. I've heard stories." Morrison nodded grimly. "Yeah, me too. They say he's got 300 warriors who'd follow him into hell itself. And if that's really his daughter, then we might have just started a war," Bradley finished. Meanwhile, Ayanna stood at the window, her hands gripping the iron bars. To anyone watching, she might have seemed like just another prisoner contemplating her fate. But she wasn't looking at the town or thinking about her own situation. She was looking toward the distant mountains where her people lived, and she was remembering the words her father had spoken to her before she left for town. "If anyone dishonors you, my daughter, they dishonor all of us. And dishonor demands an answer." As the sun climbed higher in the sky and the heat became oppressive, Ayanna began to sing softly in Apache. It was an old song, one that had been passed down through generations of her people. A song of justice, of retribution, and of the price that must be paid when sacred things are violated. Miles away, in the hidden canyons and secret places where the Apache made their homes, a young warrior named Takoda was watering his horse at a spring when he heard something that made his blood run cold. It was the cry of an eagle, but not just any eagle. This was the call that Ayanna had been taught to make, the signal that meant she was in danger and needed help. Takoda dropped his water skin and ran toward the sound, his heart pounding. He had been in love with Ayanna since they were children, and the thought of her in danger filled him with a rage that threatened to consume him. When he reached the ridge where the sound had come from, he saw her horse, still saddled but riderless, standing near a cluster of rocks. Tied to the saddle was a small piece of turquoise, one of the beads from Ayanna's hair. Takoda's hands shook as he untied the bead and examined it. There were traces of blood on it, and the leather cord had been cut, not broken. Someone had taken Ayanna. Someone had dared to lay hands on the daughter of Nalnish. Takoda leaped onto his horse and rode like the wind toward the main camp, the turquoise bead clutched tightly in his fist. He had to reach Nalnish before the sun set. He had to tell the war chief what had happened to his daughter. Because when Nalnish learned the truth, when he discovered that white men had dishonored his child, there would be a reckoning unlike anything the Arizona Territory had ever seen. The desert wind began to pick up, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of a storm. But the storm brewing in nature would be nothing compared to the tempest of Apache fury that was about to be unleashed upon Tombstone. In her cell, Ayanna continued to sing, her voice growing stronger with each verse. She was no longer just a prisoner waiting for rescue. She was a daughter of the Apache, calling her people to war. And 300 warriors were about to answer that call. Takoda's horse was lathered with sweat and foam when he finally reached the hidden canyon where Nalnish's band had made their temporary camp. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed to mirror the fury burning in the young warrior's chest. The camp was a carefully organized collection of wickiups and lean-tos, positioned strategically among the rocks and sparse vegetation to be invisible from a distance. Smoke from cooking fires rose in thin wisps, quickly dispersed by the desert wind to avoid detection. Children played quietly in the shadows, while women worked on various tasks, their movements efficient and purposeful. But it was the men who caught Takoda's attention. Nearly 50 Apache warriors were present in this camp alone, and Takoda knew that 2 other camps nearby held even more. These weren't the broken, defeated Indians that white newspapers liked to write about. These were proud, skilled fighters who had been waging guerrilla warfare against Mexican and American forces for generations. Nalnish himself sat in council with several other war leaders beneath a large overhang of red rock. At 52 years old, he was still a formidable presence, tall and lean, with graying hair that he wore long and loose, and eyes that seemed to see everything. Scars from countless battles marked his arms and chest, each one a testament to his survival and skill. When Takoda's horse thundered into camp, every warrior reached for his weapon, but when they recognized the rider, tension shifted to concern. Takoda was known for his calm demeanor and careful judgment. Seeing him in such obvious distress meant something terrible had happened. "Nalnish!" Takoda called out, sliding from his horse before it had fully stopped. "War Chief, I bring urgent news." The older man rose slowly, his weathered face showing no emotion, but his eyes sharpened with attention. "Speak, Takoda. What brings you here in such haste?" Takoda held out the turquoise bead, his hand trembling slightly with suppressed rage. "I found this tied to Ayana's horse. She is gone, taken by white men in the town called Tombstone." A silence fell over the camp that was more ominous than any war cry. The other warriors began to gather, drawn by the gravity in Takoda's voice. Women stopped their work and moved closer, their faces showing growing alarm. Nalnish took the bead and examined it carefully. He recognized it immediately. It was from the set his own mother had made for Ayana when she reached womanhood. The dried blood on the turquoise and the way the cord had been cut told him everything he needed to know about how it had been removed. "Tell me exactly what you found," Nalnish said, his voice deadly calm. Takoda described the scene at the spring, the riderless horse, and the position of the bead. As he spoke, more warriors continued to gather until nearly the entire camp was listening. The war chief's face remained impassive, but those who knew him well could see the storm building behind his eyes. When Takoda finished his report, Nalnish closed his fist around the bead and looked toward the distant mountains where Tombstone lay hidden. "Ja!" he called to one of his sub-chiefs, a scarred veteran of many raids. "Send runners to the other camps. Tell them to bring every warrior who can ride. We gather at the old meeting place when the moon rises." "Oh, how many warriors do we summon?" Ju asked, though he already suspected the answer. "All of them," Nalnish replied. "Every man who calls me war chief. Every warrior who has sworn the oath of brotherhood. 300 strong, we ride for justice." A murmur ran through the gathered Apache. 300 warriors hadn't ridden together since the great campaigns against the Mexican army years before. This wasn't just a rescue mission. This was a declaration of war. "War Chief," said an older warrior named Goyakla, "the white soldiers at the fort will come if we attack their town. Are we prepared for that war?" Nalnish turned to face his people, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of generations of Apache leaders. "They have taken my daughter, they have dishonored her, and through her dishonored all of us. If they wanted peace, they should have shown respect. If they wanted war, he held up the blooded bead. Then war they shall have. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Warriors began checking their weapons, women started preparing supplies for a long campaign, and the older men began discussing strategy. The machinery of Apache warfare, honed by centuries of conflict, began to turn. Meanwhile, back in Tombstone, Sheriff Dalton was well into his afternoon drinking session at the Silver Dollar Saloon. The whiskey had done nothing to improve his mood, and he kept thinking about the Apache woman sitting in his jail. The way she had looked at him, the complete lack of fear in her eyes, gnawed at him like a persistent itch. "Bartender," he called out, slamming his empty glass on the bar. "Another whiskey, and make it a double." The bartender, a nervous man named Pete Williams, quickly complied. He had learned long ago not to argue with Sheriff Dalton, especially when he was drinking. "You know what bothers me, Pete?" Dalton said, his words slightly slurred. "It's the way these savages think they're equal to white folks. That woman in my jail, she looked at me like she was better than me. Can you believe that?" Pete nodded non-committally, hoping to avoid getting drawn into one of Dalton's racist rants. But the sheriff was just getting started. "I think it's time someone taught her some proper respect," Dalton continued. "Maybe after dark, when the town's quiet, I'll pay her a visit. Show her what happens to Apache women who forget their place." Several other patrons in the saloon shifted uncomfortably. Even by frontier standards, Dalton's implications were crossing lines that decent men didn't cross. But no one dared speak up. The sheriff's reputation for violence was well established. What none of them knew was that Carlos Martinez had been making inquiries about the name Ayana had mentioned. As one of the few people in town who spoke some Apache and had dealt with various tribes over the years, Martinez understood the significance of what had happened better than most. He had spent the afternoon asking questions, consulting with an old Apache scout who sometimes came to town, and checking his memory against stories he had heard over the years. What he learned filled him with dread. Nalnish wasn't just any Apache war chief. He was one of the most respected and feared leaders in the entire Southwest, a man who commanded absolute loyalty from hundreds of warriors. If the woman in Dalton's jail really was his daughter, then Tombstone was sitting on a powder keg that was about to explode. Martinez knew he had to do something, but he also knew that confronting Dalton directly would be useless. The sheriff was too drunk, too arrogant, and too set in his ways to listen to reason. Instead, Martinez decided to try a different approach. He made his way to the jail, where deputies Morrison and Bradley were playing cards to pass the time. Both men looked up nervously when he entered. They had been discussing their own concerns about the situation all afternoon. "Gentlemen," Martinez said carefully, "I need to speak with you about your prisoner." "Sheriff's orders," Morrison replied. "No visitors without his permission." "I'm not asking to see her," Martinez said. "I'm asking you to listen to what I've learned about who she is." The two deputies exchanged glances. They had been growing more worried by the hour, and Martinez's serious tone didn't help their peace of mind. "What do you mean?" Bradley asked. Martinez took a deep breath. "The name she mentioned, Nalnish, I've been asking around. Gentlemen, if that woman is really his daughter, then we're all in terrible danger." He went on to explain what he had learned, Nalnish's reputation, his influence among the Apache bands, and the number of warriors who followed him. As he spoke, both deputies grew visibly pale. 300 warriors, Morrison whispered. "Are you sure?" "That's what I've been told," Martinez confirmed. "And Apache don't forget insults to their family. If Nalnish decides that his daughter has been dishonored—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. All three men understood the implications. "We have to tell the sheriff," Bradley said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You think he'll listen?" Martinez asked. "He's been drinking all afternoon, and you know how he gets when someone questions his authority." Morrison stood up and began pacing. But if we don't do something, and those Apache really do come, then Tombstone becomes a battlefield, Martinez finished grimly. As the three men debated their options, none of them noticed the figure moving silently through the shadows outside the jail. Takoda had ridden hard to reach the town before full darkness fell, and now he crouched beneath the window of Ayana's cell. "Sister of my heart," he whispered in Apache, using the traditional term of endearment between promised couples. Ayana moved quickly to the window, her face showing relief at seeing a familiar face. "Takoda," she replied softly. "I knew someone would come. Your father gathers the warriors," he told her. 300 strong, they will ride when the moon is high. Can you hold on until then?" Ayana's expression darkened. "The sheriff who took me, he plans to return after dark. His intentions are not honorable." Takoda's hand moved instinctively to his knife. "Then I will kill him now." "No," Ayana said firmly. "If you act alone, you will die, and it will accomplish nothing. Wait for my father. Let justice be done properly." Takoda wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. One warrior against an entire town would be suicide, and it wouldn't save Ayana from whatever Dalton planned. "I will watch," he promised. "If he comes before the others arrive, I will find a way to stop him." "Be careful," Ayana warned. "These white men have no honor, but they have many guns." Takoda melted back into the shadows, just as Deputy Morrison stepped outside to check the perimeter. The deputy saw nothing unusual, but something made him uneasy. The desert night seemed too quiet, too still. Inside the saloon, Sheriff Dalton was reaching the point where his drinking would either put him to sleep or drive him to violence. Unfortunately for everyone involved, tonight it was driving him toward violence. "Pete," he said, standing unsteadily, "I think it's time I checked on my prisoner. Make sure she's comfortable." The bartender said nothing, but his expression showed his distaste. Several other patrons found excuses to leave, not wanting to be associated with whatever was about to happen. Dalton made his way toward the door, his hand resting on his gun. In his twisted, alcohol-soaked mind, he saw himself as a conqueror about to claim his prize. He had no idea that death was riding toward him across the desert, carried by 300 Apache warriors who had sworn to avenge their chief's dishonored daughter. The moon was rising over the mountains, full and bright, casting the desert landscape in silver light. In the hidden canyon, Nalnish sat on his warhorse, surrounded by the largest gathering of Apache warriors seen in years. They had come from camps scattered across hundreds of miles, answering their war chief's call for justice. The warriors were painted for battle, their faces marked with traditional designs that told of their deeds and their determination. They carried rifles taken from defeated enemies, traditional bows that could drive an arrow through a man at 100 yards, and knives that had tasted blood in countless fights. But more than their weapons, they carried something that made them truly dangerous: absolute faith in their leader and complete commitment to their cause. These weren't desperate men fighting for survival. These were proud warriors riding to restore their honor. Nalnish raised his hand, and 300 voices fell silent. "My brothers," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air, "tonight we ride not for conquest, but for justice. The white men have taken my daughter. They have dishonored her, and through her dishonored all of us. This cannot stand." A low growl of agreement rose from the assembled warriors. "We do not ride to destroy the innocent," Nalnish continued. "We ride to punish the guilty. The man who took my daughter, the men who helped him, they will face Apache justice. But those who had no part in this crime will be given the chance to leave in peace." He paused, looking over his warriors with pride and sadness. He knew that this night would change everything, that there would be no going back after what they were about to do. "Some of you may not see the sunrise," he said solemnly. Some of you may ride into the spirit world before this night is done, but you will ride with honor, and your names will be remembered as long as the Apache people endure." The response was immediate and thunderous. 300 voices rose in the traditional war cry, a sound that echoed off the canyon walls and seemed to shake the very earth. Then, in perfect formation, they rode out into the moonlit desert, heading toward Tombstone and a confrontation that would become legend. Back in town, Sheriff Dalton had reached the jail. He dismissed Morrison and Bradley, sending them home for the night despite their obvious reluctance to leave. "But Sheriff," Morrison protested, "maybe someone should stay, to keep watch." "I'll keep watch," Dalton replied with a leering grin. "Don't worry about that." The two deputies exchanged one last worried glance before reluctantly heading home. They both knew what Dalton intended, and they both knew they were too cowardly to stop him. As Dalton unlocked the jail door and stepped inside, he had no idea that Takoda was watching from the shadows, his hand on his knife. The young Apache warrior was torn between his promise to wait and his desperate need to protect the woman he loved. In her cell, Ayanna heard the sheriff's unsteady footsteps approaching. She moved to the far corner, her back straight and her chin raised. Whatever happened next, she would face it with the dignity of her people. Dalton fumbled with the cell key, his hands shaking slightly from alcohol and anticipation. "Well, well," he slurred. "Time for that private conversation I promised you." As the key turned in the lock, neither Dalton nor Ayanna could hear what Takoda's trained ears had already detected: the distant thunder of 300 horses riding hard across the desert floor. The Apache were coming, and Tombstone's night of reckoning was about to begin. The cell door swung open with a rusty creak that seemed to echo through the small jail like a death knell. Sheriff Dalton stepped inside, his movements unsteady, but his intentions clear. The moonlight streaming through the barred window cast harsh shadows across his face, making him look even more menacing than usual. "Now then," he said, his voice thick with whiskey and malice, "let's discuss your attitude problem." Ayanna pressed herself against the far wall, but her eyes never left his face. Even in this moment of extreme danger, she maintained the dignity and composure that marked her as the daughter of a war chief. "You have no right," she said quietly. "What you plan to do will bring consequences you cannot imagine." Dalton laughed, a harsh sound that grated against the night air. "Consequences? From who? Your savage friends? They wouldn't dare attack a white town. They know what would happen to them." He took another step closer, and Ayanna could smell the whiskey on his breath, see the predatory gleam in his eyes. "Besides," he continued, "who's going to tell them? You think I'm planning to let you go after this? You think I'm going to let you run back to your people with tales of what happened here?" The implication was clear, and for the first time, a flicker of fear crossed Ayanna's features. Not fear for what he might do to her. She had been prepared for that possibility from the moment she entered white man's territory. But fear for what her death would mean for her people, for the war it would certainly bring. Outside, Takoda had moved closer to the jail, his every instinct screaming at him to act. He could hear voices inside, could sense the danger Ayanna was in. His promise to wait for the other warriors warred with his desperate need to protect her. But before he could make a decision, he heard something that made his blood sing with fierce joy. The sound of approaching horses, still distant, but growing closer. His people were coming, faster than he had dared hope. Inside the cell, Dalton had moved close enough to reach out and touch Ayanna. She dodged his grasping hand with fluid grace, but the cell was small, and there was nowhere to run. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," Dalton snarled. "You can cooperate, or I can make this very unpleasant for you." "I will never cooperate with you," Ayanna replied, her voice steady despite her circumstances. "And you will pay for this dishonor." Dalton's face flushed with anger. "Dishonor? You think you have honor? You're nothing but a savage, and it's time someone taught you what that means." He lunged forward, trying to grab her, but Ayanna was ready. Years of training in Apache fighting techniques served her well as she evaded his clumsy attack and struck back with her elbow, catching him in the ribs hard enough to make him grunt with pain. "You little wildcat," he gasped, his hand moving to his gun. "I was going to make this easy for you, but now—" His words were cut off by a sound that froze his blood in his veins, the war cry of Apache warriors, still distant but unmistakably real. The sound echoed across the desert like the howl of avenging spirits, and even Dalton, in his drunken state, understood what it meant. "What the hell?" he whispered, moving to the window and peering out into the moonlit night. At first, he saw nothing. Then, like a vision from his worst nightmares, they appeared on the ridge overlooking the town. 300 Apache warriors silhouetted against the full moon, their weapons glinting in the silver light. Dalton's face went white as he realized the magnitude of what he was seeing. This wasn't a small raiding party or a handful of desperate renegades. This was an army, organized and disciplined, led by someone with the authority to command such numbers. "Nalnish," Ayanna said softly, and there was pride and love in her voice. "My father has come." The sound of her voice broke Dalton out of his stunned paralysis. He spun around, his gun now in his hand, his face twisted with rage and fear. "This is your doing," he screamed. "You called them somehow." "I called them with your own actions," Ayanna replied calmly. "Every insult, every act of disrespect, every violation of honor, these things have consequences." On the ridge, Nalnish sat his horse like a statue carved from stone, surveying the town below. His warriors were arranged in perfect formation behind him, waiting for his command. The war chief's eyes found the jail immediately, guided by Takoda's earlier reconnaissance. He raised his hand, and the night fell silent except for the restless movement of horses and the whisper of wind through the desert sage. "People of Tombstone," Nalnish's voice carried clearly across the distance, amplified by the natural acoustics of the valley. "I am Nalnish, war chief of the Chiricahua Apache. You hold my daughter prisoner. You have dishonored her and through her dishonored all Apache people." In the town below, lights began appearing in windows as people woke to the sound of his voice. Doors opened cautiously as residents peered out to see the army of warriors surrounding their community. "I offer you this choice," Nalnish continued. "Return my daughter unharmed and deliver to me the man who took her. Do this, and the innocent among you may leave in peace. Refuse and face the consequences of your actions." In the jail, Dalton's hand shook as he pressed his gun against Ayanna's temple. "Tell them to leave," he demanded. "Tell them I'll kill you if they don't go away." Ayanna looked at him with something approaching pity. "You still don't understand, do you? You think this is about saving my life? This is about honor, about justice. My people would rather see me die with dignity than live with shame." The truth of her words hit Dalton like a physical blow. He had expected to use her as a hostage, to bargain for his life. But if the Apache cared more about honor than individual survival, then his only leverage was worthless. Outside, Nalnish was growing impatient. He could see movement in the jail, could sense that his daughter was in immediate danger. "You have until the count of 100 to comply," he called out. "After that, we take what is ours by force." The count began, each number called out in Apache by the assembled warriors. The sound was rhythmic, hypnotic, and absolutely terrifying to the people of Tombstone. 1, 2, 3. In the streets, panic was beginning to set in. Some residents were grabbing their belongings and fleeing toward the far end of town. Others were barricading themselves in their homes. A few brave souls were gathering weapons, preparing to make a stand. 10, 11, 12. Carlos Martinez appeared at the jail door, his face pale but determined. "Sheriff," he called out, "for God's sake, let the woman go. You can't fight 300 warriors." "Get out of here, Martinez," Dalton screamed back. "This is none of your business. 20, 21, 22. More townspeople were gathering outside the jail now, their voices raised in argument and fear. "He's right, Sheriff," someone called out. "We can't fight that many. Give them what they want. Don't let them destroy the whole town for one woman." 30, 31, 32. Dalton looked around wildly, seeing his support evaporating like water in the desert sun. Even his own deputies were nowhere to be seen. They had either fled or were hiding. 40, 41, 42. Inside the cell, Ayanna began to sing softly in Apache. It was a death song, a traditional melody that Apache warriors sang when they knew they were about to die. But there was no fear in her voice, only acceptance and pride. 50, 51, 52. The count was more than halfway done, and Dalton could see that his time was running out. In desperation, he grabbed Ayanna and dragged her to the window, pressing his gun to her head where the warriors could see. "Stop counting!" he screamed. "I'll kill her. I swear I'll kill her." The counting stopped, and for a moment an ominous silence fell over the desert. Then Nalnish's voice rang out again, and this time there was something in it that made even the bravest men shiver. "If you harm one hair on my daughter's head," the war chief said, "I will not simply kill you. I will make your death last for days. I will make you beg for the mercy of a quick end. And when you finally die, I will hunt down every person who helped you, every person who stood by and did nothing, and they will share your fate." The absolute conviction in his voice left no doubt that he meant every word. 60, 61, 62, the count resumed, and Dalton realized that his threat had accomplished nothing. These Apache warriors were not going to be deterred by the possibility of Ayanna's death. They were going to avenge it. 70, 71, 72. In desperation, Dalton looked around for another option, another way out, but there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The Apache had surrounded the town completely. 80, 81, 82. Some of the townspeople were now openly calling for Dalton to surrender, their fear overcoming their loyalty to white authority. "Give her up, Sheriff! Don't get us all killed for your pride! 90, 91, 92! Dalton's nerve finally broke. With a curse, he shoved Ayanna away from him and ran for the back door of the jail, hoping to escape in the confusion. But Dakota was waiting for him. The young Apache warrior stepped out of the shadows like an avenging spirit, his knife gleaming in the moonlight. Dalton raised his gun, but Dakota was faster. The blade found its mark with deadly precision, and Sheriff Marcus Dalton collapsed to the ground. His reign of terror finally ended. 98, 99. As the count reached its climax, Dakota burst into the jail and unlocked Ayanna's cell. She fell into his arms, safe at last. 100. The final count echoed across the desert, followed by a war cry that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. But it was not a cry of attack, it was a cry of victory. Justice had been served. As dawn broke over the Arizona desert, the Apache warriors began to withdraw, their mission accomplished. Nalnish had his daughter back, and the man who had dishonored her was dead. Honor had been restored. The people of Tombstone watched in awe as the greatest gathering of Apache warriors in years simply melted away into the desert, leaving behind only hoofprints in the sand and a story that would be told for generations. Some said it was a miracle that the town had been spared. Others said it was justice, pure and simple. But everyone agreed on one thing. They had witnessed something extraordinary, a demonstration of the power of honor, family, and the unbreakable bonds that tie a people together. The sheriff had taunted her, thinking she was just another Apache woman. But what happened next had indeed become desert legend, a legend of justice, honor, and the terrible price of disrespect. Hey, my friends, help me by subscribing to the channel so we can reach 1,000 subscribers, even if you're watching from your TV or computer. Your subscription makes all the difference, and the algorithm will help you see more amazing stories. Leave a like or an emoji in the comments and be part of this growth.